So this is about a trip to visit the Maya in South Mexico. Um, I had had a little bit of anthropology and a lot of chutzpah, and the result was that I was able to take a not entirely safe for me journey down to Mexico. Uh, it is part of the description of the spiritual quest, partly because at the time I was what you could call a desperate seeker after reality, which of course was in front of my nose all the time, but I didn't know that. So I had to look for it. And I ended up spending the last, or most of the last of my money on the first annual Gnostic conference on the West Coast. It was held in Mount Shasta, California. And I went there. There were about, 40 of us or so. Very excellent conference. I'm especially remembering a translation out of the Coptic of one of the Hermetic writings that didn't appear in the Hermetic corpus. It was called The Eighth Reveals the Ninth, and the ninth is the ninth level above the earth where the choir of angels is, and the eighth is where you view it from. So it had to do with the ascent through the various planetary spheres. Interesting stuff. Anyway, the conference ended, and we were all sitting around the lunchroom having coffee, and it was time for everybody to disperse. So Bishop Stephen stood up, and everybody got up to go their separate ways, and I had nowhere to go, so I was still sitting there. It was a very odd feeling. The Gnostic conference dispersed. I decided to go camp in the woods outside of the town, and I went into a laundromat with my backpack and my hiking boots, and a lady came in there and said, "I'll buy you some coffee." And I said, "Okay, sure, thank you." And so we had coffee together. And she said, "I'm an ER nurse, and I don't want to see you in my ER." Because she recognized, she's used to people that are edgy that come into town, usually starry-eyed about some spiritual idea or other. So she recognized the type, and here the boots and the big backpack, I guess, gave me away. So anyway, we had a very nice interaction, and I was totally surprised that happened until a few days later after I'd established my camp at Bear Creek. Here I was breaking 11,000 feet on the mountain in tennis shoes. It's like I got near the mountain and the mountain took me and showed me what the mountain is. Luckily, I didn't fall off of it, but it was definitely a dumb thing to do, what I did. It's embarrassing to describe, but I was walking along a horseshoe kind of configuration in the snow, and I'm traipsing along. The snow was the right consistency, so the feet sunk easily into it, and so even though the ground was not level, it was easy walking. And then I stopped in the middle and looked around and realized that I was on a very exposed space, that slope went down at a pretty radical angle, and that there were boulders at the bottom, and that if I fell off, I would slide down and be seriously injured. And I hadn't perceived that, so I looked back at my steps, and it's bonk, bonk, bonk. And then I got to that middle when I realized where I really was, and proceeded to find a rock that was shaped like this, and used it as an ice axe, and proceeded around the rest of the bowl, making deep steps in the snow and using the rock to balance against the slope. It was a strange experience. I got to the other side, and the two people on skis at the next ridge saw that I was safe and skied away. And then I came to my senses and went back down to a safer altitude. That Mount Shasta really is a mystical mountain, and it really does have a Lemurian energy to it. It's astounding. But that kind of thing, I guess, happens to a lot of people that go there. Anyway, I continued to keep my camp at Bear Creek. I would go into town every few days for beer and food. And of course, I was getting broke. One time I was in town, and there's a bookstore called the Golden Bough in Mount Shasta. I went in there and bought a copy of the 10 Keys of Enoch, written by Mr. Hurtak. Very interesting corpus. But one of the Keys of Enoch contained a diagram, or rather a map, of North America, and it showed a dove descending. The wings of the dove were on the North American coast. The head of the dove was in Yucatan. The eye of the dove was in Palenque. And the text indicated that there would be, during the Harmonic Convergence, which took place in 1986 or 7, this was in 81, that this dove would descend and the coast would be dangerous, but that it meant a major descent of light into the planet. Okay, well and good, and I looked at that. But I think I'll digress and talk about the Harmonic Convergence. I did take part in that. I went with 2 other people up to the upper reaches of South Thurston County on some hills, and we found a nice place for a campfire, looking at the stars. People all over the continent were gathering in groups, big and small, to celebrate the Harmonic Convergence, which had to do with the end of the Aztec version of the Mayan Calendar. So in a way it was a foreshadowing of the flap over 2012. So it had that kind of cosmic New Age imprint about it. There in 81, of course, nobody had heard of it. The hype had not begun. The beautiful experience of being at the convergence had not begun to arise in people's consciousness. In any case, I remember walking away from our campfire and walking up to the along the gravel road up to the top of the little hill we were at, and there I experienced in my mind's eye some of the other people that were participating in the conference, and there was an air of calm and excited interest in. I think most of the people that went to the convergence shared something like that. You know, it was a meaningful experience to those of us that went to it. Anyway, this was 5 years prior, back in 81, and I looked at that map with the head of the dove in Yucatan and the eye of the dove in Palenque, and I thought, well, I wonder if there's anything to that. I'd been around the block enough with the metaphysical world to know that not everything in print has anything like accuracy or reality to it. And then I thought, okay, why don't I go there and find out for myself? So that's when the seed began of that trip to Mexico. It became part of my quest. When I ran out of money, I worked in a forest fire area putting protective tubes around seedling trees. They were regrowing a forest of ponderosa pine, which has nice straight grain, easy to harvest. And we worked on that project for probably a month. Very interesting circumstances. We camped in the woods on the edge of what was a field of gray ash as far as you could see, and the skeletons of the manzanita trees were everywhere. Some ranger gave me 2 raw rabbits, dead rabbits, and I cooked one of them over the fire. It was quite good. The other one was stolen from me by a feral cat who jumped into my camp with the rabbit sitting right by the campfire, grabbed it and ran off. I was totally astounded. And this was, the beginning of, shall we say, odd experiences that were set in motion by my decision to make a journey to the Maya in South Mexico. So the stage was set, and I had enough money to tread water, and then I received a legacy from my friend Margaret, who I was a medical attendant to, she was paraplegic, died of liver cancer, and left me a small legacy, a few $1,000s, a couple thousand, I think it was. And so I bode my time until that legacy came through, and that plus the money I made tubing trees was enough to get me started. I hitchhiked down to L.A. Meanwhile, I had written to my friend Barbara, who is a hieroglyphs expert. She's deciphered some of the main remaining puzzles in the Maya decipherment. And I got very interested in things Mayan during that time. Anyway, I wrote to her and said, I'm taking a trip to Maya land. Can you help me out? And she wrote, sure, come on over. And she was in Austin, Texas, which is where a major Mesoamerican department exists. And I took the hitchhiking to L.A., stayed with my Gnostic friend, the bishop. He was Hungarian. He had barely gotten out of Russian-occupied Hungarian. He was on some kind of hit list. He had escaped to Vienna, and he was approached by whichever it is, MI5 or MI6, saying, well, there's a hit list from East Europe, and you're on it, so don't go back. And he ended up moving to L.A. and started the Gnostic Church, the Ecclesia Gnostica there. Anyway, he very kindly put me up in his small apartment. We went to various metaphysical activities. He said, well, we'll put you on the permanent prayer list because you'll probably need it. And then I got on a bus to Texas and got off in Austin, and there was my friend. She was involved in a group of Mayanists and spelunkers that were associated with the university. And so I met all those people, very nice people. And they each gave me a hint, like, don't swim in Lake Coba, it has liver flukes. It's like there's a big lake in the Guatemalan border, and if you go there with an inner tube, you can float out to the island, which has ruins on it. If you get to Chichen Itza, there's a cave you can sleep in. And likewise in Uxmal, which I didn't go to, there's a series of caves which were probably used for ceremony. Anyway, so I was over-equipped with things to do. And the result was I got farther into the jungle than I had any right to do on my first visit. I'd never been to the tropics before. But the stage was set. I worked hard on the Mayanry. In fact, I had this book in the bottom of my backpack, and I studied on it rather assiduously. It has quite a few bits of information about things Mayan. I don't know what this is. Calendar. Yeah, the Mayan calendar is incredible. It has a 260-day sacred cycle, and it has a 360-day year with 5 intercalary days. Anyway, I was able to go to a graduate seminar on the Mayan hieroglyphics, which had just been deciphered over the previous decade or two. And of course, I understood almost nothing, but I got a gist of what it is, and was able to study the day signs and the month signs and the calendar system, which is intricate. They have what's called a long count, which is 13 baktuns that amount to 5,000-year cycle. So the Maya were way into time cycles and interacting cycles. They had a level of precision that was incredible, but they didn't use decimals, they used whole numbers. So it's like 40 of those or 8 of those other, that kind of thing. So they would expand out with these monstrous, huge numbers. Anyway, that's part of the interest in things Mayan, the way the astronomy and astrology and mythology of the Maya was structured. But I wanted to meet the actual Maya who are still there and still pretty amazing. So I paid my dues there, went through all the hoops that people provided that I could, and had a working knowledge of what I might expect. Then I went to Houston, got on a plane, and flew to Merida. And that was a matter of what I call bioshock. I was prepared for the culture shock, having had a little bit of experience with non-Western people. But I was astounded by the bioshock. It's like everything was different. The sun was hotter in the sky, noticeably. The way it heated things up was entirely different. The air had the tropical quality to it. All this was new to me. And I remember being on the bus into town from the airport. Colorful buildings, all brightly painted, beautifully kept. And people were going about their ordinary business. Could see that through the windows of the bus. But also through the windows of the bus, piles of dead locusts. And I never asked around to find out what the deal was with the locusts. Obviously, they were alive at one time, but there were a lot of them. And so there had been a locust infestation at some point in the not-too-distant past. The other thing about the... I'll save that for later and continue. I had a little thin guidebook that was from the Gringo Trail, from people that were really knowledgeable. And again, I couldn't take all the hints that were in there. They'd say things like, go to the prison and buy one of their handmade hammocks. And they mentioned a hotel in Merida that was run by a prominent family, and recommended to stay there while in Merida. And it was too expensive for my budget. I had to be very careful about expenditures. But I stayed there 3 days getting my bearings, and it was a marvelous place. You go out during the day exploring Merida and come back in the afternoon, and it's water in fountains and cool stone tiles. The temperature inside was practically cloud forest temperature, while outside it was tropical heat. This was in February, I believe. Anyway, after 3 days, I had my grounding enough to proceed, and I took a bus to Valladolid, which is a town in the middle of Yucatan. Nice town. I enjoyed it there. I stayed probably 3-4 days. I got a hotel, a cheap hotel, a room, had green walls and a big fan, the tropical cliche, that fan moving slowly, stirring the air up so that at least is in motion. And I still had pretty major culture and bioshock, but I stayed put for a while, got my bearings, and then proceeded to go to the Caribbean coast. There is an island on the southeast corner of Yucatan called Isla Mujeres, the island of the women. And they had a ferry service out to the island. I remember getting on the boat, and it was one of my first interactions with the Maya. Oddly enough, I skipped the whole episode in Chichen Itza. I'll have to backtrack. But the Mayan woman on the boat was just sitting there the way you'd expect an old woman to do. But she had a very intense presence, a solid concentration, open awareness. And I just sat there across from her. No words were spoken, couldn't be comprehended anyway. Nothing was said, but there was a feeling of rapport and deep, concentrated awareness. I was amazed to experience that connection. Before getting to Isla Mujeres, I went from Valladolid to Chichen Itza, which is one of the major Mayan ruins of the later period, the Yucatec period. It's rightly famous. It's a beautiful set of structures. There's a big pyramid called the Castillo, and there's a observatory building. They were very into watching the stars. The Mayans were sky watchers, so all the temples are aligned according to the rising of things like Gamma Cygnus and the solstice sun and the descent of the moon on the day of the winter solstice. That sort of thing. The temples are all aligned to those energies. I found a cave. The first cave I found was scuzzy. It had some debris in it, a bit of garbage, and it was wet. But I found a dry cave and set up shop in there, stayed in there probably 3-4 days. There was one disadvantage to that spot. It was near a big searchlight. There was a fancy hotel across the street. Obviously I had dropped out of the tourist circuit by that point. I was deep in the Gringo Trail and things like that transpire. So when I got out of the cave at night, the searchlight would cast a large human shadow across the caracol, the observatory that the light was set to illuminate. And I thought, I wonder how many people on the verandas saw that figure of a human shadow across the observatory. When I was exploring the ruins in Chichen Itza, I kind of avoided the big stuff, the cenote where the sacrifices were thrown, that had been dredged for all kinds of treasures, the large pyramid, the Castillo, and I went instead to Old Chichen, which was a totally obscure, older set of structures that was offset from the main ruination, and spent a lot of my time in there. It had a small, tiny replica of the Castillo, maybe 2 stories high or so. The Castillo itself is huge, but it was the same shape as the Castillo. So that was the prototype. I met a photographer in there, and he was running around looking for things to photograph, and we found the stone head of a bat and propped the bat up, and he took a picture, and we wandered around together for a while looking for artifacts. And of course the tourists were all across at the big big ruination, didn't see the small ruination, so it was pretty quiet in there. Yeah, it's a matter of some mystery why the Maya built pyramids. They're structurally a little different from the Egyptian pyramids, but they have a sacred significance that, of course, has been partly forgotten. There were staircases up to the temple on the top of the pyramids, and they'd perform human sacrifices at the top of the pyramid, and then roll the bodies down the steps and dance in the human skin. This luckily for the victims, happened very rarely, and usually it was a game of princes going out in the jungle in groups, trying to capture the most important person from the rival city-state that they could find. So it was a prince's game, a macho prince's game, and anybody that was captured was taken and caged, and then at the appropriate astrological alignment for the designation of a new heir, or the birth of a new heir, or the installation of a king, they would sacrifice the most important captive they had. So it was a bit of a gruesome business. It was a very, what we would call primitive religion. And they were a lot like the Greek city-states in that kind of a situation. The rivalry amongst the city-states, Palenque was one of the main ones, ensured a constant low-level skirmish situation. And as I say, that was the testing ground for the princes. Anyway, it's really unknown what the use of the structures were. The Caracol does look like an observatory, and very many of the ruins have little windows in the stone wall aligning to certain stars, or as I say, moon risings and settings, things of that sort. So it was all a sacred business. These were not dwellings. The dwellings were on the outskirts. These are the ceremonial centers of a large complex, a small city. And in some cases, the outskirts have been excavated. In many cases, they have not. There was a whole series of roads behind Chichen Itza, and I took to wandering around there because I like to hike. And two interesting events happened in there. One time, I came to a crossroad, and there was a little purple coral snake. I'd never seen those shades of lavender before. It was beautiful. But they're very deadly. And I'm not sure if there's even a vaccine for them, an antidote for their poison. But there it was. And luckily I'd been briefed on all that stuff, so I had some idea that's a coral snake. That's very dangerous. So I stood there and I gave it a lecture about not biting humans. Whether it hurt me or not is unknown. But that gave me pause for thought. And then probably on the same day I was walking along, and some Mayan women came out of the woods, and they'd been gathering firewood. So they had tumplines and bunches of firewood on their backs. And as we approached encountering distance, I greeted them, and I said, what's that called that you're carrying? And they said leña, which is the Spanish word for firewood. And I said, no, what do you call it? And they said, talansit. So that was my first Mayan word. Talansit means firewood. And little bits and pieces of experiences like that do not make a Mayanist. Let it be clear, I was just playing in Maya land and doing my best to understand what it really was anciently and currently. Speaking of currently, back in old Chichen, I went into a little temple building, and on the lintel was written Noch Kulkulkan, which means Great Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl is the feathered serpent that is the image of Venus in that particular mythology. It's common to all of Mesoamerica, this figure. Quetzalcoatl was a culture bringer, and there are all kinds of stories about how Quetzalcoatl civilized the Maya. And there is also a story that Quetzalcoatl is going to return when there's great trouble in the land. And unfortunately for the Aztecs, they mistook Cortez for the return of Quetzalcoatl. But that's a different tale for a whole different day. Anyway, I go in there and I see Noch Kulkulkan, and I knew enough Yucatec to know Noch meant big. And the Kulkulkan, Gukamats, was one of the names of Quetzalcoatl. And then I looked in the corner, and there was a stone altar, and it had some debris on the top of it, and I could tell it had been recently used. And I think that they probably burned what they call copal incense. I burned some in the Palacio of Palenque as an offering. It's the pitch of a certain tree, and it has a nice aroma. Anyway, that was a fully active altar for an old pagan deity that had been suppressed for 500 years, by the Spanish, and yet still thrived. There's a strange accommodation between Catholicism and what's left of the Mayan sensibility. It's definitely, for instance, there's a certain Juan de las Cuevas, Saint Juan de las Cuevas, the saint of the caves. The caves were where the Mayan initiatic ceremonies and secret transmissions took place. And it turns out that this Juan de las Cuevas was a thinly disguised image of God in the Mayan pantheon. I think it was God in. The one with the roach with the butt of the cigarette. Anyway, I'm not sure of those details anymore, but the bottom line is they went too far that time, and that particular saint got removed from the canon. But there was an accommodation of the old ways, and yet the Spanish basically destroyed the Maya high civilization. And they destroyed Mesoamerican civilization on purpose with malice aforethought, with intent, with the excuse that these were devil worshippers and we got to put an end to their deviltry and force Christianity on them. One of the saddest incidents, they were busy converting the Maya to Christianity in Yucatan. I'm not sure what town in Yucatan this took place. It was a Dominican bishop, Diego de Landa, who was in charge of the Yucatan for the Inquisition, I guess. And they were converting the Maya to Christianity and telling them the usual stories. And one Easter, the Mayans, the Mayan nobility, crucified a couple of children, literally, using wooden crosses and nails the way they were taught. And of course the Christians were flabbergasted. They never realized that they would take that seriously, literally. And they were totally appalled, and De Landa ordered all the Mayan codices, of which only 3 remain, to be destroyed. And they made a huge bonfire and destroyed the result of centuries of astronomical investigations and mythological elaborations, and who knows what all was in those codices. It's regrettable that misunderstanding took place on such a deep level, but the result was that the Mayan codices were destroyed irrevocably. A lot of the elite Mayan people who were involved in such things committed suicide at that point. They had literally beheaded the Mayan culture. And this went on, and yet here's an instant where you see that the cult of Quetzalcoatl is alive and well. And there's a lot of other things in Maya land that supposedly had been destroyed, but in reality are alive and well. Okay, I'm off the podium now. I'm back in Chichen Itza. I see this. I note Quetzalcoatl, Copal. So I wasn't exactly worshiping in the Mayan way, but I was definitely going as native as I possibly could as a U.S. tourist. So those experiences all added up to what I could call a experiential overload. I'm pretty sensitive, so small events can take me some process time. Introverts are like that. So I got to Isla Mujeres. There was a campground there. I pitched my tent on the sand and did practically nothing for probably 10 days. And I didn't want to be speaking English because I had rudimentary Spanish. Started with my 50 words and a table of the grammar and an ability to speak French. So I had a start, but my Spanish was not nearly up to the task I had set myself. So not speaking English was the first step in the immersion. We didn't have much interaction with any but the touristic people among the Mexicans. But there were a whole bunch of Quebecois in that camp. They had escaped from Quebec because of the winter. As I say, it was February. And it's really cold in Quebec in the winter time. So they were all down in the south, young men having a good time. We drank a lot. They were good to hang out with. They spoke some English and I spoke a little bit of French. So we were able to communicate. They took to gambling a lot. That was their enjoyment, drinking and gambling. So I drank with them, but I didn't gamble with them. though I sat around there was a little hut that was kind of common area for all the campers. And we were sitting in there on the picnic tables, drinking and gambling. And in Mexico, the military mixed freely with the population. This was true in 1981. I'm sure it's still true today. You can tell they're military, even though they're in plain clothes. You can tell they're military because they have nice, shiny boots. Anybody that has nice, shiny boots in Yucatan is in with the military. So anyway, the guy in regular clothes and nice, shiny boots came in, and he just sat there and watched the game. And I sat there, I was drinking and watching the game. And he went away. The game went on. It was some kind of poker. I don't remember which kind. Anyway, it wasn't more than a couple hours later when a uniformed officer of the Federales, the national police, came in and said, you can't gamble here, that's illegal, and shut down the game. And okay, the game was shut down. We still had the drinking and the carousing. So the federal officer went away having made his point, and the games didn't start back up. Anyway, those little interludes went on until it was time for me to move south. My destination was Tulum, a ruin on the coast in Quintana Roo, not far from the Belizean border. Tulum was a minor city-state on the sea. It's a pretty good ruin, actually, for the fact that it was a smaller city. And the ruins were in good shape. At that point, I didn't need buses. I started hitchhiking, so I'm in at the Isla Mujeres, and I hitchhiked down the coast. I ended up getting a ride with some Canadians who were touring from Canada in Cancun. And these were fairly rich Canadians, not super rich, but they were obviously abundant money. It was no concern. They had rented a Jeep. And so we were running around looking at the ruins, and they'd do things like take a picture of us, and they all pose on the steps of the pyramid, right? And being the ugly Canadians, you'd heard of the ugly Americans. Well, they were the insensitive tourists. We'd drive into a village, and they'd jump out, and somebody would go over to a group of Mayans, hug the nearest Mayan, and pictures would be taken, and they had bragging rights when they got back to Canada. So this was the circus that went on, and I was amused by that, but it was certainly time to continue. So when we went to Tulum, then I said, I'm going to go over there and camp in those cabañas. And they were totally appalled. You mean you're going to camp there? And I said, yeah, that's what I'm doing. And they said, wow, and went back to Cancun and had their party. And I pitched my tent in the sand. It was a couple pesos a day to camp there. And went to the ruins often enough to get an idea of what the energy was like in Tulum. And I took to walking on the beach, of course, beachcombing. And I was walking in the forest near the beach, south of the town of Tulum, when I came across a palapa. A palapa is a palm leaf hut. You string small limbs, straight limbs, small trees in a pattern, and then you bend palm leaves over the crossbars, and it makes a nice hut. I forget how they did the roof. Anyway, there it was, empty. And I thought, far out, I could camp here. And I went looking around the forest in the immediate area, and there were some New Zealanders in a van that had set up at the end of a road in the forest. So I went over there and I said, what's with that palapa over there? And they said, well, about a month ago, somebody showed up here with a bag of peyote and moved into the palapa. And he just left yesterday with an empty bag. Okay, and I moved in. So yeah, it's hard to remember the energy in that camp, but it was pretty amazing. I could have slept in the palapa, but it was open to the jungle, and even though it was on the coast, so the wind coming in from the Caribbean would blow the mosquitoes back. So it was relatively a good spot in a lot of ways. It was still connected to the whole rest of the forest. So I wanted to sleep in my tent, which was bug-proof. So that's what I did. I pitched my tent next to the palapa and slept in there. There was a hammock in the camp, campfire pit. I cooked a lot of food on that fire, and the hammock was made up of plastic bags in knots. Whoever did it must have beachcombed for the plastic bags or gone to the few dry garbage dumps that were around there and knotted each plastic bag, making that hammock. It was really beautiful work. It shows what you can do when you have next to nothing. Who'd have thunk that you can make a hammock out of a bunch of plastic bags? But there it was. I wasn't there too long when Ramon showed up. He said, "I like to speak English with everybody people." That was the extent of his English, and I thought, perfect, and so naturally we had to converse in Spanish for the most part, and I began learning my Spanish pretty much in earnest. And so I had my Mayan calendar nailed to a tree, and was still studying all this stuff, and at the same time enjoying the tropics. It was one of the better spots in the tropics. Probably now gone. There's probably a hotel there by now. But in '81 there was that campsite. And that little guidebook mentioned that there's a camp south of Tulum, or there used to be. Anyway, it turned out that Ramon, his moon, Ra for sun, Mon for moon, Sun Moon was his name. His mother was an Italian junkie, and she got deported, leaving him an orphan. So he was raised in an orphanage, and considered to be crazy, and outcast by the Mexican society. But that's how enclaves always were. I'm making a connection with South Mexican style, and so I'm marginal in that world. And the other people that I encounter are also marginal in some way. It works the other way too. The people at the top are marginal in that they're isolated. So the anthropologist comes to the village and immediately meets the chief and is hosted and wined and dined by the chief, if he's welcomed. If not, there's always the cooking pot, right? That's how that used to work in the old days. Anyway, it was a similar thing. The Mexican that I drew was extremely unusual. He made his living entirely by selling marijuana. And in fact, he left the camp one time to go down to Bonampak to get a kilo of marijuana and bring it and sell it in small amounts. And I said, "You can come back here, but don't bring that kilo into the camp." Because it was there was lots of ambiguity about the illegality of marijuana in Mexico. But we're cruising along, becoming friends. I'm getting used to Ramon's style. He wasn't all that crazy, I'll say that. He was a wounded person, but then he was raised in those kind of circumstances. Anyway, he came back. He couldn't get buses in there. There was a storm or something, so he didn't get the key. Didn't get the kilo of grass. But we continued. The little stores in Tulum would not serve him. Only the government food store would serve him. Because, as I say, it was outcast, so I would shop in the little stores. And we had a pretty good working arrangement. Now, one time, a constable from the town of Tulum showed up at the Palapa, and he was looking for a bribe. And so he was shaking down the gringo, right? Catch him with the marijuana, and then offer to let him off the hook with a nice bribe. So all well and good, and he searched my tent, and he found my tarot stash. He says, "What is this?" And I said, "These are playing cards." And then he looked at this Mayan Calendar sheet that was nailed to the tree and said, "What's this?" And I said, "That's a Mayan calendar." And he finally gave up and realized he wasn't going to get a bribe because he didn't have anything on me, right? And meanwhile, Ramon is lying in the hammock, cracking up. The constable ignored him because he's obviously a local and has no money. And sitting on the table next to the hammock was a matchbox with a marijuana roach in it. And constable went away, and we all had a good laugh, and life continued. Anyway, another thing that happened, and this was before Ramon arrived. I got up in the morning, and I usually have coffee, and I found I was out of coffee. Instant coffee in jars. But there was a jar of coffee an used up jar of coffee in the camp, and it had a residue of coffee in the bottom. So I thought, okay, I can make a cup with that. So I boiled some water and poured the hot water into the container without breaking it, and managed to get a cup of coffee out of it. And I'm lying around on the hammock, and I notice, gee, everything looks pretty small. And I'm looking down at the ground under the hammock, and there's a little place where the water in a rivulet had flowed during the rainy season. And there were a couple of shells in there, and everything looked strangely unfamiliar. And then I realized, oh, that coffee I drank was mixed with peyote. So all of a sudden I'm high on peyote, and I had determined to avoid drugs while I was there. I'd been avoiding marijuana anyway because of past bad experience with the social effects of smoking marijuana. So I resolved to stay clean during that trip, but then it kept intervening in my space because it was all over the place. Anyway, here I am high on peyote, like it or not, and I liked it. I enjoyed it. It was a very good trip once I understood what was happening to me. And I had all kinds of ideas. That little rivulet below became the Usumacinta River, and somewhere I scored a little plastic canoe, about a couple inches, and put it in there, and took the corpse of a crab, a crab leg, very colorful tropical crab, and put it across there as a bridge, and made a little installation. Then I made another one called Parque de las Ruinas, excuse my bad pronunciation, the park of the ruins, and took slabs of rock that were different shapes and made what looked like ruined buildings out of them. And then the third installation that I made, this was after I came down, of course, but the idea was born in that peyote trip. Then I made what I called Ciudad de Tapas de Botella, the bottle cap city. And I had been checking out the region, of course, all around there. And as I say, there were several dry garbage dumps. Not a scrap of food, not a scrap of anything rotting, just a lot of dry cast-off material. And there was a lot of plastic and a lot of bottles. And I took the bottle caps and made a miniature city out of them, which is kind of absurd, but I had the leisure time and the inclination, so that's what I did. And then Ramon showed up, and there were two of us in that crazy world for a good while. And I met other people coming and going. Some of them were on the Gringo Trail. Some of them were on the tourist trail, and had pretty good interactions with the other travelers. Well, it came time to part, and it turned out Ramon had next to nothing, and I gave him a few things from my stash, but probably not as much as I should have or could have. And then he stayed in the camp, and I went on my way going south towards Belize. And I would like to have gone to Belize, but I was pretty broke by that time, and I didn't want to face the border questions, and Belize wants you to have money if you enter it, and on like that. So I hitchhiked east from the coast, and hitchhiking in Mexico, all I can say is I'm glad I had plenty of experience already. Having hitchhiked in Europe and hitchhiked in the States, hitchhiking in Mexico is not too difficult. And not very dangerous either, as it turned out. A lot of truck drivers would stop and give me rides because there's not that much traffic in South Mexico. Anyway, I got to town and finally got to a town where there was a train station. Took the train to Palenque.